Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2You Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2you.net/sociology. And once you're on there, you can get revision guides, you can get flashcards, you can get revision videos and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode is Professor Dick Hobbs. Dick, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Dick, I always ask people to start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do, if that's okay.
Yeah, Dick Hobbs. What am I? I've been an academic since the 1980s, and I worked at where did I work? I worked at University of Oxford. I worked at Polytechnic of Central London, University of Durham, LSE. And for 3 years, I think it was, at University of Essex. And I'm also got a connection with Western Sydney University, but I'm retired now from the British academic grind. And I retired about 5 years ago, I think it was, although I am still writing.
Do you miss the teaching?
Well, I miss the contact with the students as was. I mean, I was lucky. I think when I came into teaching, I got my first teaching job, I think in 1989. And then I went to Durham in 1990. And I stayed at Durham teaching and doing research for 15 years. And during that time, it was a good time to teach. I had small groups. I got to know the students as much as I wanted to know them, or as much as they wanted to know me. I had some good PhD students, and all was well. But things have changed massively in terms of teaching loads, the demands made upon academics. I was lucky. I had light teaching loads. No one asked me to be a clerk. I didn't have much admin to do, if any admin to do. I got off very, very lightly compared with young academics who are coming into the business now. So I guess, no, I don't miss the teaching grind, although I do kind of sometimes miss some of the best bits of the interaction.
Yeah, totally understandable. Now, anyone that knows anything about your work, Dick, knows that kind of crime is your area. I'm always interested in how people go into the field that they did. So what really sort of attracted you to that area of sociology?
Well, I went to university when I was 30. I went to university when I was 30, which at the time I felt ancient. I look back now and I was just a baby in arms, but nonetheless, I was a mature, or I was an mature student, I guess. And I'd gone through lots of different jobs. I left school, as most people did at those times, quite early on with very few qualifications, but I didn't need qualifications to do the sort of jobs that I was doing, which was low-level clerical work, office boy, filing clerk, messenger type stuff, and then labouring jobs, which I did for a few years. And I went to night school, got O-levels and A-level, and with that I managed to bluff my way into the teacher training college. Worked as a teacher for 4 years, but I really liked sociology. I like sociology. I like the sociology of education, the sociology of work, and the sociology of deviance. Those three, I think, were the areas that kind of interested me. And I then went to university. I went to university when I was 30. And when I got there, I started to read, and I found that a lot of the stuff that I was reading about working class culture, whether it was education, whether it was work, whether it was deviance, it didn't really measure up to what I knew. By that time, I'd been through loads of different jobs. I've been left school for 12, 13 years, something like that. Yeah, about 13, 14 years, I think it was. I've been left school for. And I'd done a lot and I'd seen a lot. And I'd been brought up in an environment where there was a lot of crime. Crime was pretty normal. I was living in the East End when I went to university. I kind of knew about how crime worked, and I knew about how normal crime was, and that crime was just part of people's lives in the same way that, you know, going to work was, or going to the pub was. It was just it was nothing exceptional. And I was hit by the way in which crime was presented as being an exceptional activity, something different, something that had to be dug out and often presented in terms of pathology and individualism. But to me, it was just pretty normal. So I kind of thought, well, maybe I could be onto something here. Maybe I could get into researching. Maybe I could get into writing about something. I thought I had something to say. And what helped me more than anything else was a history book. When I went to the LSE, two of my tutors there, Terry Morris, who brought the Chicago school to the UK, and David Downs, who produced, up to my mind, one of the best subcultural studies, youth subcultural studies. He produced it in the 1960s. And they were both talking about this new book that had come out called East End Underworld by Raphael Samuel, who's a historian, an oral historian. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And some of the stuff that was going on at the LSE, I didn't like, I didn't understand, I wasn't interested in. I found it kind of elitist. But this sounded an interesting book. I got hold of the book and things took off from there, really. It was a wonderful book. There were places I knew, there were people that I knew. I showed the book to my dad, and my dad knew some of the people that were in it. And wow. He could remember when he was a kid. And it all kind of made sense. And it really made, if you like, academic life, which, let's be fair, it can be pretty obscure, a lot of the research that's produced, but it made it real. And it took off for me then, really, and with that particular book. And from that, I then got into Chicago school, the subcultural studies that were coming out at the time that were very popular at the time, a lot of American work, a lot of American policing stuff I found interesting because it was quite gritty.
Yeah.
And, we'll watch American cop shows on the telly, whether we like them or not, they're there. There was some of that subcultural stuff that was coming out on the subculture of the police, that was coming out of the States, was really, really good and really quite fierce stuff and gritty stuff and unapologetic. It was real. And I like that as well. I like that stuff. I like that stuff as well. And really, that's when it kind of took off for me. And I went to Surrey to do a PhD. I was supervised by Nigel Fielding, who just finished his fantastic ethnography of the National Front, right-wing politics. And he was brilliant with me. He was absolutely excellent. And he was into police. He was getting into policing at the time. And he was introducing me to some of the Americans who were coming over to see him. People like John Van Manen and Peter Manning. Really good interactionist-based ethnographers, really interesting people. Got to know them, got to know their work. And while I was at Surrey, I put together a PhD looking at entrepreneurship and the working class in East End and their relationship to detectives. And that was my PhD, and I turned it into a book called Doing the Business. And luckily, the book came out just as the job market loosened up a little bit. I spent a brief, about 3.5 years at Oxford University, and I Oxford didn't like me, and I didn't like Oxford. It wasn't great, but I needed a living. I needed to make a living. That old mortgage needed to get paid off. I had bills to pay, so I swallowed a lot of crap when I was at Oxford. But nonetheless, the book came out. Doing the Business came out. There was a loosening in the job market, and I was offered a couple of jobs, and I chose to go to Durham. And at Durham, I was set free. At Durham were fantastic. Durham University was fantastic to me. They let me do what I wanted to do. They let me teach what I wanted to teach. They let me research what I wanted to research and gave me plenty of time and opportunities to put in for grants and stuff. Yeah, so that's how. Sorry, long-winded, but nonetheless, that's how I got going.
So just thinking about doing the business, because that's probably where a lot of students listening will know your work from. That was late 80s, was it 88, 89, that sort of period?
Yeah, 88 that came out, and yeah, and I was lucky. There was it was very well received, and I ended up doing radio programs on it and some TV, and it got well reviewed. And it was back in the day when it was really hard to get a book published.
Yeah.
It really was hard. I was rejected by, I don't know if it was 10 or 11 publishers knocked me back. Couldn't get published, including Oxford University Press. They knocked me back. And then they had a new editor arrived. And he didn't know that his publishing house had already knocked me back. So I contacted him, although it was a fresh thing, and yeah, they accepted the book, and it did well, and it just seemed to hit a nerve in people. It was a kind of new old-fashioned book, you know. It was an old-fashioned ethnography in some ways, but I was dealing with stuff that was going on at the time. There was a lot written in the press about corruption, police corruption, and I was saying, well, this stuff, it's not really corruption we're talking about here. It's a symbiotic relationship between the cops and villains and ordinary people doing ordinary crime, and it caught people's imagination. And also, and I've got to admit this, I've only realised it recently, but it did come out at the same time that Only Fools and Horses was popularised, and there were a number of spin-offs from Only Fools and Horses as well. So there was that kind of consideration of London. Docklands was starting to hit the news. It was being built. Canary Wharf was being built, and there was all this kind of stuff about entrepreneurship got from Thatcher. And you had Del Boy on the telly on a Wednesday night, you know, with his cocktails with umbrellas in it, talking about being a yuppie or an entrepreneur. And somehow it was connected with that. I mean, it wasn't deliberate, but it came about at the same time. So, yeah.
Because you had Minder on TV at the same time as well, didn't you? Which, Minder's probably closer to doing the business than anything else it was at the time, because it's I mean, I spent a lot of time in pubs. It was hell, but someone had to do it. And I spent a lot of time in pubs talking to people and finding out what they're going on, and then going into their homes and talking to them, getting to know their families. And that was through the 80s. That was sort of from 81 right the way through the 80s. And pubs were important then, and pubs were different. You know, pubs were full of smoke. There was no mobile phones. There was licensing laws that closed them up at, what was it, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, whatever. They closed up and opened up again at 5 in the afternoon. Not that the pubs I was going in took any notice of the licensing laws, but there was but it was, you know, it was a different world. And as far as the East End was concerned, it was different as well, because you still had the culture that was a spin-off from the docks, and the thieving that went on in the docks, and the culture that went on in the docks, and also the culture that emerged from casual work of going to the docks and lining up, shaping up, as they put it, for work in the morning, and being selected, a bit like you know the film On the Waterfront, the Brando film. A fantastic film. Well, that was the way it was, but it wasn't gangsters that was running it. It was just ordinary working class people that were ducking and diving and hoping for a few bob to feed their families. So this was not that many years after the docks shut down, and the culture, the people, the kind of the feel to the place hadn't changed that much at that particular time. It was in the 90s that it really started to change. So doing the business is a case study, if you like, of a culture just about to change. It's interesting that some of the references you made there, because I really loved Danny Baker's books, which were then made to TV programme Cradle to the Grave. And that was all set in the docks, wasn't it? And his dad was a proper character. And it's interesting you mentioned Only Fools and Horses, because John Sullivan, the writer, you know, when he was asked who was your inspiration for Del Boy and all these characters, he said, I've seen them, I've met them, I've seen them in pubs. You know, they were based on real people. Yeah.
Oh, well, I remember I gave a paper somewhere, I wrote a paper, and I used some terminology. What was it? Oh, I used the terminology, this time next year we'll all be millionaires. And some guy came up to me and said, you took that from Only Fools and Horses. I didn't. John Sullivan took it from working class culture at the time. It was a saying that was spinning around at the time. And Sullivan had a great ear. You know, he had a great ear. He really did. He had a great ear. He understood that market culture, that ducking and diving, that delusional field, a lower culture, a working class culture at the time, that this time next year we will all be millionaires. And I still know people, you know, I've stayed in touch with these people over all these years, and some of those people still use that kind of terminology. You know, they use that kind of terminology. And at the time, there was all these changes going on. You know, Thatcher brought in the idea of selling council houses off. And that had a massive impact on all working class culture. People could become homeowners, and then they could sell their homes and make profit on it and move on. And it changed. It became aspirational. It was still very much working class. These people didn't want to be middle class. The last thing that they wanted to be was middle class. But they wanted to make a few bob, because it was only a generation or maybe two generations backwards that you know, their parents were going to school with no shoes, that their parents were suffering from rickets, that their parents were being bombed and fighting in wars and having terrible, terrible times. And then suddenly they're being given the opportunity to make money on the house that they're living in. I mean, it seemed an extraordinary thing. But that really marked that era. You know, Thatcher brought that in 79. And the 80s was an explosion in these weird mutants that were starting to appear within working class culture. People who voted Labour but wanted to make profit on their house. People that were trade unionists but wanted to own a flat in Croatia or whatever. Yeah. You know, it was weird. It was changing. And I happened to be there at the time and caught a little bit of it. I didn't catch all of it, but I didn't know what I was doing. You know, I was just writing what was around me. And using academic language and using sociology to make sense of it, because that's what sociology was and still is. At its best, it gives a language, it gives a vehicle, a platform, maybe, a platform. It gives a platform for ideas about the world that surrounds us, rather than just describe it. You know, that's just field notes. That means nothing. You've got to make some sense of it. And sociology can help to make sense of it. And I love, you know, I still do. I like to write because I find that I'm working things out for myself. And certainly in the 80s, I was making a lot of sense, trying to make sense about my own environment, about my own family, about my own background, about my own culture, about the economy that surrounded me, because it was weird.
And you've already mentioned there, Dick, you know, ethnographic research, participant observation. When you were chatting to the characters in the pubs and the police and everyone else, were they always aware of who you are and what you did, or was there any sort of covert research you were doing?
It was a mixture, really. Most of the time, they knew what I was doing. I was this thing called a student. I mean, you've got to remember that back then there was only 10% of the population went to university. I think something like that. It was small. Well, around my way, we didn't know any students. I didn't know any students. Nobody knew any students. And suddenly there's this gomless geezer in his 30s who claims to be a student. Yeah, do you want to talk to him? Do you want to talk? Yeah, go and have a word with him. He'll buy you a drink, you know, and that was it. So there was a lot of that going on, you know. There was a lot of that going on. And people taking the piss out of me because I was a student and that sort of stuff. And they were saying, you're a bit old to be a student. And like, well, yeah, I am, as it happens. So what do? You work in the docks. And off we went. We'd have a chat. If you're in a pub and there's like 50 people in there or something, and there's stuff going on and you're watching and listening, you can't go around, you know, saying to people, actually, I'm a student. Do you mind if I take some notes down, please, sir? You know, all you're going to get out of that is a right-hander. You know, that's not the way to go about things. So I don't think I was actually ever covert, you know, undercover, wearing a false moustache or anything like that. But yeah, most of the time people knew what I was up to, but sometimes they didn't. But this was before we had so many restrictions and restraints on field work. I mean, carrying out field work now is much harder. I don't think I would be allowed now to do what I did in the 80s. In fact, I know I wouldn't. I've been told I wouldn't. I wouldn't be allowed to do it. My supervisor, Nigel Fielding, did his work on the National Front. He wouldn't be allowed. He carried out his work in the 70s. he wouldn't be allowed to do that work now. And even his supervisor probably wouldn't have been allowed to do his work. That was Paul Rock, and he carried out his work in courts. He probably wouldn't be allowed to do it. There's so many restrictions and restraints under the guise of ethics, but I don't believe it's ethics. I think it's just middle-class moralising and managerialism, but that's another subject.
It's really interesting when you say how all of that came together, that book really was released at just the perfect time, wasn't it? What was happening in the media, what was happening politically, what you could and couldn't do academically is kind of a perfect storm, really.
Yeah, it worked ideally for me. You know, I thought I was writing quite an old-fashioned book because I was reliant upon, you know, I was reading Raphael Samuel and Gareth Stedman Jones, in particular, the historians. And then I was using a lot of Chicago school work. And I thought this was a tradition. And I thought I was trying to be, I was trying to be part of this world, this weird academic world, but only the segment of that academic world that made kind of sense to me. So I used, for instance, Jason Ditton's work, Part-Time Crime. I read that and I thought, oh, yeah, he's got it. You know, he worked in a factory and looked at the fiddling culture that was going on in the factory, and the bread salesman ducking and diving and fiddling and creating it, doing this sort of crime. I thought, yeah, that's the world. That's the world I recognise. So Jason Ditton's work, the late Jason Ditton's work, he died a few years ago, but what a fabulous book that is. And that made sense to me. So I thought I was writing something that was pretty standard, pretty sort of ordinary and quite old-fashioned. But it hit at a particular time. And I mean, on the day the book came out, I was on Radio 4 midweek with Libby Purvis. That night I was on, I don't know, was it Capital Radio or something, with Johnny Walker, having a conversation with Jules Holland, who phoned in to talk about something or the other. I thought, oh, this is the game. This is great. You write these academic books. And you get, when I got back from the Libby Purvis interview, there was a message waiting for me in my office. I was working at Oxford. There was a message waiting for me from a film company who were interested in me writing a film, doing a British version of Scorsese's Mean Streets. I mean, I'm not making this up. It was unbelievable. And that all happened in one day. It tailored off a little bit after that, I've got to say. But there was something about that book at that particular time that really hit. You know, as I say, if someone came up with, and now, in fact, I know a number of women who have come to me as students, PhD students, and said, two women came to me separately, a 5-year gap between them, and said, I want to write a female version of Doing the Business. Mm. And I said, yeah, great. It's totally male orientated, what I've written, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I know what I've done. That's it. It stands as it is. You come along and do it. So women involved in ducking and diving, entrepreneurial lifestyle and all the rest of it really need it to be done. They were both rejected by the ethics committees of their respective universities. They were both knocked back. You can't do it now. It's really, really difficult. So I was extremely lucky.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
I wanted to move on to your upcoming book. The title sounds a little bit familiar, The Business.
Yeah, I've got no imagination.
The first question is, how much of it is connected with doing the business?
Well, it is connected. There's no doubt about it. How the book came about is this, because I think it's quite important to explain how our books get written and how they're produced, because there's no mystique to it. But students in particular seem to think there's some mystique, you know, that you go into a room and a load of mist comes down on you in this room and you come out with a book. It's a bit different from that. I retired from British University system 5 years ago, I think it was, and I had some work to do. I did have some writing to do, and I wrote a book with colleagues on the London Olympics, on the policing of London Olympics, and a few other bits and pieces. But basically, I was kind of retired and occasionally I'd write a handbook piece or something like that, but I was sort of fading out of it. But I was doing a lot of media work, which I quite enjoyed. I find it easy and I can get away with it, basically. That's it. So I was doing some TV work, and it was 2 years ago, and I was doing Who Do You Think You Are? I've done a few of those on various people. And I did 2 Who Do You Think You Are's in the summer of 2019. And as a result of that, a publisher contacted me and said that they wanted to talk to me and that they wanted to sign me up and to write a non-academic book. And I'd always had for a number of years, I'd had in mind to do a non-academic book. Basically, because I play old man's football, and I gave a talk. I was asked to give a talk to the blokes in the football team, and they're all over 50. They're aged between 50 and 85, I think it is. These guys, and kick a ball about a few times a week. Great. And so I gave this talk, and they said, "Tell us about your work, what you did." So, all right, this is what I used to do, and this is what I've done. And I got into talking about the Krays and the Richardsons and armed robbery and drugs and all this stuff. And they loved it. And they would come up to me afterwards and asking me questions and telling me things as well. I mean, that's important. You know, everyone's got a life. Everyone's got something to say. And these guys were telling me things that they'd been involved in and people they knew and etc. So I thought, wow, there's something out there beyond the academic world. And there's something out there beyond academic life. And people might be interested. So when I was talking to the publishers, I said, well, what about this? What about if I bring together the ethnographic work, if you like, or the essence of the ethnographic work that I've done since the early 80s, and bring it up to date and just put that together in a non-academic framework? And they said yes. And then lockdown came, and I had nothing else to do. So I've put this together. It is linked with doing a business. It starts off with a kind of autobiographical stance as to how I got interested in crime and why. And then the world of doing the business, the world of the East End in the 70s and 80s. And then I move on to other work that I've done, ethnographic work on professional crime, organised crime, drugs and that sort of stuff. Some stuff which is already out there in academic books, but you do realise that academic books, not many people read them. It's a small marketplace compared to the true crime marketplace.
Especially looking at the prices, Dick.
Oh, unbelievable. I mean, it's embarrassing. I mean, that was one of the things that over the years how people have said, oh, that sounds an interesting book you've just written. I'm going to buy it. And they and I thought, oh, I know what's coming next. And then the next minute they come up to me and say, someone's just tried to charge me 65 quid or 80 quid for a book. I think it's wrong, don't you? It must have been £6.50, not 65. No, mate, it's 65 quid. It's embarrassing. That's what it is. That's what it is. And so this was an effort to write a book that covered the same issues that I've kind of covered in my career, looking at changes that are taking place in crime, changes that are taking place in working class culture, and to try to present it in a way that was non-academic. You didn't need a PhD to understand it. And I hope that's what I've done. With regard to the title, The Business, yeah, I know. I've written a book called Doing the Business. I also wrote a book called Bad Business, and now I've come back to The Business. I've got no imagination at all.
I'm not sure about that, Dick. But I really like the idea of illegal capitalism. We've already mentioned the kind of classic Del Boy Fly picture we kind of associate with the 80s. Now, yeah. I'm assuming that illegal capitalism and the Del Boy characters still exist, but what are they doing today? What are they doing in 2021?
That's a great question. What would Del Boy be doing now? Well, Del Boy will be knocking out cheeky grams of cocaine. There's no doubt, And I think that's one of the interesting things, that the cliche that you get in crime fiction, a lot of crime fiction, particularly TV and film, is that, the evil drug dealer. Well, there's a lot of people using drugs, and someone's got to sell it to them. And Del Boy would see a chance. He'd see a market. He'd see a niche in the market, and he would be knocking it out. And he'd be stepping on it with talcum powder or baby milk or whatever it happened to be, powdered milk. He'd be stepping up, and he would be making a few bob, and he would be dressing well, and he would be buying his flat in Mandela Towers, and that's what he would be doing. So Del Boy would undoubtedly be doing that. He'd have an eye on the buy-to-let market. Is it going up or not? He'd have an eye on phone frauds. How do I get in on that? How do I get in on that? Have anyone got any connections in Mumbai? He'd be looking for that in order to pull that one off. And generally speaking, he would be part of the illegal capitalism of the 21st century, which is built on an everyday basis. It's built around drugs. I mean, one of the things that I wrote about early doors was about thieves. Everybody was either a thief or buying from thieves. Everybody was involved in it. Absolutely everybody. It was across the board. Now that marketplace has gone, and it's gone for a number of reasons. The docks had gone from London. It cleared out. It took years for the docks to go, and for the warehouses and the depots and everything that surrounded what had been the biggest docks in the world. So that meant that the targets had gone. It meant that the lorries had gone. It meant that the warehouses had gone. So, but those people have moved on to something else. They've had to move on to something else. The other thing that happened was, with regard to stolen goods, was that clothing was always the item everybody wanted. If you could get a few boxes of shirts or a lorry load of jeans, or that was fantastic. You could change that. A lorry load of jeans could change someone's life. If you had hold of that could change someone's life. All that's gone now with cheap imports. The cheap imports that have come in that flood the internet and flood the high streets. Well, you can buy a pair of jeans for a £5 or a £10 now. Who's going to bother stealing? Who's going to bother stealing a lorry load of that when you can go to a cheap shop in the high street and buy it? So all of that market has gone, but the niche is still there. People who don't earn very much money in the legitimate world, people who are looking for a bargain, people are looking to feel good about themselves by buying at one price and selling at a higher price. All of that that's not gone away. So Del Boy will be into anything that was going, but stolen goods, well, not really. It's not a big area anymore. That kind of thing has faded almost to oblivion. But drugs, why not drugs? He'd be into it, And I think that's one of the things that I've always been criticised in the past, and I stand by it, is that you can't write this sort of stuff or research this sort of stuff and take a great moral stance. Yeah. You just can't do it, and that's why I wouldn't get through an ethics committee.
I just wondered, you just mentioned about clothing at the time of recording, the Euros are on. Is there not a market for sort of moody England shirts, knockoff kind of England shirts and all that sort of game?
Yeah, the snide stuff. Yeah, the snide stuff's everywhere. I mean, the snide stuff's everywhere. Yeah, that's it. The snide stuff's there, but it's not, it's relatively minor. I mean, in my new book, I did one of the people that I've written about, because it's not all old stuff. There's new stuff in there as well. And one of the people that I've written about made a good living for a number of years by knocking out snide shirts. He had the patterns. He bought the computer programs to produce that had patterns on them for Prada, Lacoste, Ralph Lauren. And it was polo shirts. He had a good connection in the northwest of England for the cloth. He had another connection somewhere else for the buttons. And he was working with someone that was producing this stuff. And some of those snides were so good that they were being put into legitimate shops as part of their legitimate stock. So yeah, that market is there, but it's not major. It's not major. I mean, if you want to get into counterfeit medicines, counterfeit prescription drugs, those kinds of counterfeits are still there. So, but yeah, the counterfeit world, you're right. It's still there. Still make money from it, but it's not what it was. I mean, in fact, the counterfeit thing is interesting because there was a case a few years ago of a major manufacturer who found that counterfeits of their goods were being made that were so good, that was so good, they bought the factory that was making them.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, you know, so it's kind of, it's just the market. It's just the market. There's nothing too sinister about it until it gets to prescription drugs and medicines. Car parts, that's a good one. Counterfeit car part. That's running. That's been going for years. That's been going for years. So yeah, you're right. The counterfeits are out there, but it's not that mass market, that huge mass market that I was talking about in the 80s, where, you know, everywhere you went. I mean, where I was brought up, for instance, there was a pub down the road about 150 yards away from where I lived, and on a Friday night in there, more meat was sold than endurance.
Yeah,
you know, because we had the docks down the road, we had the roll docks down the road, which had the biggest cold store in the world, I think it was at one point, and meat was pouring out of there. Lorry loads of meat was coming out of it, pocket loads. And there was one story about that where a guy was walking down the street, and a bloke in front of him, and he was staggering all over the place. He thought he was drunk. He thought this guy was drunk, and eventually this guy's fallen on the floor, and this passerby has run to him, and he's loosened his collar and everything, and his face has gone blue. He thought he was having a heart attack, and they've phoned the ambulance. The ambulance comes out, takes him into hospital. They cut the clothes off him, trying to find out what's wrong, and he's got a scaffolding belt on. And the scaffolding belt's inside out, and inside he's got sirloin steaks, frozen sirloin steaks, up against his skin, underneath his trousers, and he was freezing to death. He had a hypothermia, and that's quite typical. The amount of stuff that came out of the box was just stunning, unbelievable. Those days have gone. You know, those days have gone. It's changed.
I used to, I went to university in Portsmouth, which is obviously a dock area as well. And yeah, I remember people come round on a Friday night with bin bags full of, you know, moody Ralph Lauren shirts, videotapes, sorts, you know.
Yeah, the videos. I mean, the young guy who until just recently, it's probably still going on, but until very recently, you know, you find in pubs a young guy turning up with a great big box full of DVDs of recently released stuff, and that was it. And that's replaced in a lot of ways the shellfish vendor who used to go around the pubs on a Friday night. You know, it's just a way of life. But there's not a lot of money in the counterfeit at the retail level of counterfeiting anymore, because a lot of stuff has got so cheap. You know, you can download stuff, you can download films all over the place illegally. Well, you know, it's cut out the street corner dealer, the ducker and diver.
I mean, that is interesting. I mean, people, like you said, people might not like it or might not accept it, but it does seem to be then the big bucks are really in the drug world. Is that right?
Yeah, the drug thing is important, but people who are in the drugs trade, most of them that I've encountered over the years, try to get out of it.
Yeah.
Their object of being in it is to get out of it with enough money to set themselves up. Sometimes they're realistic about the amount of money that they're going to make and what they're going to be able to do with it. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're dreaming of being in the Cayman Islands or laying on a beach and operating a global drugs empire. All that tends not to work out too well. Other people just want to buy a semi in the suburbs and get out quick and buy a corner shop. You know, it's every man and woman for themselves. That's what they're doing. But certainly drugs is the way to go. But if you really want to make money, quickly move it into property, and then you can be legitimate. They all want to be legitimate. They don't want to be criminal. They don't acknowledge their status as criminal. You know, they don't say, well, if I say these people, you know, they've just done 15 years for importation or whatever, and I say to them, so are you an organised criminal? They'll laugh in your face. They don't see themselves as that. They see themselves as business people who are a bit dodgy, you know, doing something a little bit on the side, and unfortunately they got caught. But they don't acknowledge, you know, people that do crime don't acknowledge the sanctimonious legal definitions of their activities. They see themselves as money makers, and that's what they want to be.
And do you want to tell us a little bit more about the book that we've just been talking about, the business? So paperback version's out mid-July, isn't it?
Yeah, 22nd of July it's out, and it's stunningly cheap and a real bargain. And I think it's about £8, something like that. Well, as I say, previous books of mine have come up at 65, 80 quid, whatever. So it's a little bit different. And basically what I've done there is I've just tried to present the ethnographic work, which is pretty vivid stuff. I've tried to present that and describe it and contextualise it without using academic language.
Yeah.
You know, I want it to be available to students, to whatever, to use as they see fit. But I do not I didn't want it to be restricted, and I did feel that, you know, for someone who's banged on about equal opportunity in education, etc., blah 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 for decades, and then I'm writing a book which is, you know, goes out at 65 quid. It was a bit hypocritical. So. And what I've tried to do with that, I've worked through from doing the business, or pre-doing the business actually, through doing the business, bad business, and then studies that I've done of drugs. The bouncers work that I did with Stuart Lister and Phil Hadfield and Simon Winlow. I did that in the late 90s into the early 2000s. And I think that was for me, that was really quite interesting work. You know, it was a collaborative study working with younger scholars, looking at the way in which bouncers and the drugs trade and muscle violence is highly marketable. And so I've used some of that material in the business, and then moved on to some studies that I did with various other people on my own and with various other people, including the late great Jeff Pearson, on drugs, on drug markets. Where we had interview data collected by other people from prisons, and I've written that up and tried to compress it and to make that readable and understandable to everybody, really, without too much angst. And then I'll move on to, you know, what's happened now. And I think one of the things that struck me when I was writing this is a bit of a kind of valedictory book in a lot of ways, because I've had to look back and think, well, why did I write this? What's the purpose of it? And where are these people now? You know, where are some of these people that I started off with in the 80s, or even some of the people I started off with when I knew when they were ducking and diving, when they were at it before I became an academic. Some of these guys, I'm still in contact with now. Only a few I'm still in contact with now. I know them. I know their families. I know their kids. I know their grandkids. In one case, I know their great-grandchild. And see where they are now and how crime has treated them, how the economy has treated them, and how they've coped. That was quite salutary for me to consider that. I mean, I knew it was going on, but once you start writing it down, you look at it, you think, oh, that's not worked out too well for him, or that's worked out very well for him. So yeah, I've tried to do that, and to see how they've coped with moving away from the ducking and diving culture, the stolen goods networks, and all of that really kind of dominated their lives, and they thrived on some of them. They really, really thrived on it. Where are they now? What did their kids do? Because that culture wasn't available to them. What have their grandkids done? And that culture wasn't available to them. And 9 times out of 10, the drugs trade comes into play. Yeah, 9 times out of 10, the drug trade comes into play, and it doesn't always end well. So I've tried to kind of bring it up to date and to try to contextualise it, to say the way the East End has changed as well. Large chunks of it have been gentrified. The jobs have changed. You've not got an area. You're not talking about an area which is dominated by a single employer, such as the docks. The factories have gone. The processing was linked with the docks, the sugar trade, all of that. It's gone or almost entirely disappeared. Property prices have gone up through the roof. Canary Wharf, the Isle of Dogs, all of that was so solid. You know, the Isle of Dogs was such a solid working class working area, you know, an industrial area, obviously swept away, wiped away. Moving out to where I lived out in West Ham, just that little bit further on down the river, what's happened there. And also acknowledging changes with ethnicity. When I started writing in the 80s, it was never an all-white area, but it was certainly dominated in the 80s. The dominant culture was white culture. Well, that's changed as well, but it's not dominated by anyone now. It's a very cosmopolitan area. So, and lots of different ethnicities have got their finger in lots of different pies. both legal and illegal. So it's fragmented. You've got a fragmented culture, and that has to be acknowledged. For any researchers trying to go into the field and do anything as I carried out, I think it's more difficult because the culture is far more fragmented. Also, the pubs have gone.
Yeah,
that's the main thing. I mean, my mental map of the East End was based around pubs. I'll meet you in the Green Man, and then we'll be off to the Beggar, and then we'll go here and blah blah blah. That's gone. That's finished. Lots and lots of those pubs have gone. They're turned into flats, or accidentally they've had a fire and been rebuilt as flats as accommodation. The market isn't there for pubs as it once was, because many of the newcomers to the area, or relative newcomers over the last 30 years, alcohol isn't central to their culture, so the pubs aren't full anymore, and so they close down. And some of the stuff that I've written about in the later stages of the business acknowledges the changes in the pubs, the changes, what the pubs what they used to look like, and what they look like now. And there's one particular pub which I've called the City Arms. It's not its real name, and I write about it in what it was like in the 80s, and then what it became like in the 90s, and it's now been gentrified, and it's a very different place with a very different clientele.
Yeah, I can imagine. I just had a look for you, Dick, whilst we were talking. You can pre-order your book, W.H. Smith's Waterstones, and you've got an audiobook version as well coming out.
Yeah, I did the audio.
Excellent.
I did the audio. Ray Winston wasn't available, and I think he might have been a bit more expensive than me. So, I did the audio, which was an experience. Just leave it there. It was an experience. I enjoyed doing it, actually. Yeah. It was reading your own words is kind of daunting, but I did enjoy doing it.
Brilliant. If people want to find out a bit more about your work or the book, Dick, is there anywhere else they can look online to find out more details?
I've not got a website or anything modern like that, so not really. I guess it's from the books. I think what I tried to do with the book, as I was writing it, I realised what I was doing is there's a very strong autobiographical feel to it for me as a writer, anyway, and it's a strange experience because I start off writing about when I was a kid in the East End, what it was like. Then I moved through to what it was like being a student in my 30s. And here I am, 2 weeks away from my 70th birthday, knocking out another book and trying to say, well, this is me now, and this is the area that I wrote about now. So it's a weird thing. It's a one-off. I'll probably get run over by a bus now.
But it's that's amazing just to see those kind of changes. I think that's fantastic. I'm sure your voice comes across brilliant on the audiobook. I'd love to have a listen to that when it comes out.
Well, it comes across, whether it's brilliant, and I'm not too sure. But I couldn't blame the scripts on anybody else. Which was a bit difficult, and also it was kind of strange that I had to read people's voices. Yeah. From who are gone, who are dead. I mean, that's another thing. A lot of the people that I've written about are gone. The people I wrote about in the 80s, they're all gone. Most of the people I wrote about in the 90s are gone as well. So the idea of hiding their identities or masking their identities or something, it's been completely unnecessary. And indeed, a couple of the people, their real names are in there, because their progression, I won't give it away, but their progression in life and in crime has been quite extraordinary, and I think quite notable. So I've left their names in there. But it was quite an experience.
Cheers, Dick. Looking forward to it. Well, I just wanted to say thank you very much for giving up your time today, and also best wishes for your 70th. Did you say, is that in a couple of weeks' time?
Yeah, it's a couple of weeks' time. Yeah, I may go in a pub.
Yeah. Do that. Well, thanks again for your time today, Dick, and I really do appreciate you coming on to chat to the show.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed talking to you. Thanks very much.
Great.
Smashing. Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.